Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2014 NEX virtual workshop. Just to give you a little background on the workshop, the theme of this workshop is to use Earth observations for creating climate resilience. And the workshop has three components. The main component is lectures by experts in the field, talking about the state of the art in climate science, and then followed by labs that are hosted on the Amazon, where people can deploy these for analyzing climate and satellite data, and followed by a challenge that is open to anybody around the world that can use these tools and data in creating a solution that would help climate resilient communities. So the challenge comes with the large prize money. So we're hoping for a wide participation. Today we have Dr. Fred Lipschultz from the U.S. Global Change Research Program talking about the National Climate Assessment. And Fred has been a NASA representative for the last few years at the Global Change Research Program. He's one of the regional coordinators helping with the National Climate Assessment. He's intimately involved in working on the recent report that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And Fred will be talking about the third National Climate Assessment, climate change impacts in the United States. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Fred.
All right, thanks, Rama. Appreciate it. As Rama said, the report just came out, was released by the president on May 6th, and has been extremely well received, with many hundreds of thousands of hits to our new website and downloads of the website of the report and its various components. So I'd like to tell you a bit about the report and starting with the key findings, the science first, and then tell you a bit about the program that created it, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and then dive in a little deeper to the National Climate Assessment process itself, especially how we're thinking about what the next steps are and how to use the third National Climate Assessment as a tool for resilience. So the main messages from the report, which you've heard echoed from the president on down through the secretaries and all through the administration, are these. The first one is that this assessment is the largest and most comprehensive one on the impacts to the United States. So this is different from IPCC, which is a global assessment. This one is how it affects us in the United States. The other main message is that climate change is happening now, that this is not something, as we've been saying, that people think is going to happen 100 years in the future, but is already happening in all regions and all sectors. That Americans, the whole nation, everyone across the country are feeling these effects. And critically, as the president points out repeatedly, there are important opportunities to manage the climate change and to prepare for its effects as we move ahead. So we need to be thinking about these not just as problems, but as opportunities. So those are the highest level messages that you've been hearing. The report has 12 key findings that dive into this in a bit more detail, and I'd like to now walk through these 12 key messages produced in the report and some of the graphics that accompany that. So the first one is the most obvious one for a report like this, that our climate is changing, and that this is apparent, and that there's underlying the report and this conclusion is that there are a wide range of observations backing it up. So this example gives you an idea of the change that's been observed across the United States. So the map shows you the current status, and in the bottom corner you can see the decadal averages of those changes, showing what we've already experienced. So climate is changing. and that human activities are a primary driver. And there's lots of evidence presented in the report to detail that. But there's a whole range of extreme weather events that have increased, and that many of these increases are related directly to human activities. And one example that's shown here is a map of our 8 regions in the National Climate Assessment, and they illustrate the changes in the top 1% of precipitation events, how much more rain has fallen over recent decades currently as opposed to in the 60s, 1960s. So you can see concentrated, especially in the Northeast and in the Midwest, very large changes in the precipitation, in the most heavy events, not the average rainfall. So looking at those specific things that would cause flooding. These changes in the climate that we've observed are expected to continue, and that they will accelerate as global emissions change. So if we have several different emission scenarios that are possible futures for not just the US, but globally, those 2 emissions that are shown here, one called A2, the higher emission on the right, shows the trajectory of emissions that we're currently on and are projected to continue. And then the lower emission, E1 on the left, illustrates what a future might look like if we can dramatically curb our emissions trajectory from release of CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And you can see then that the kinds of temperature changes that we would expect to see in 2100 compared to currently are shown as that temperature change across the nation, considerable change projected then as possible in the future. So people are already experiencing these impacts in many sectors, economic sectors, but also in regions all across the nation, and are becoming increasingly disruptive. One of the significant parts in the report has to do with the fact that climate change directly threatens human health in a wide range of ways, not just the obvious ones through extreme weather events and wildfires, but also things like air quality and diseases. So 2 of the maps, the map on the left shows changes that are projected for tick habitats, deer tick, in the east of the country. The map shows the present distribution of the deer ticks, and then the potential distribution in 2080, and shows that some areas of the country will see dramatic increases, such as in the Midwest, but also some areas, such as in the Louisiana, Mississippi area, might show decreases due to the extra heat that's also occurring at that time. On the right, you can see that wildfires, in this case up in Canada, are affecting our health through smoke inhalation and small aerosols, all the way down to the DC area. The report spends a lot of time discussing the fact that our infrastructure is being damaged by a whole range of climate change impacts, sea level rise, downpours, extreme heat, and that these damages are projected to increase with continued climate change. Another key finding is that the water quality and the supply of water to the nation are being jeopardized, and that these affect not just the ecosystems, but also everyone's livelihoods and access to sufficient and high quality water. You can see on the left the trends in flood magnitudes across the country changing. And you can see that in the Southwest, there's projected then to be dramatic decreases in flood magnitudes, but large increases in the upper Great Plains, Midwest, and in the Northeast. Part of the story about water quality and supply has to do with the projected changes in temperature, as I've mentioned. So you can see on the right what we observed in 2011 in Texas, with the number of 100-degree days that reach 100 degrees or more. And those are projected to increase in the future, again, making it very difficult because of the temperature to have enough water due to evaporation processes. We expect disruptions to agriculture to increase. These two plots show two major crops in the Midwest and how they respond to changes in temperature. These are observed changes, thus plotting the kinds of yield one gets from growing these crops compared to the changes in the maximum temperature that they experience during their growing season, showing that as the temperatures increase, the yields decrease. So the concept is that these are therefore projected to, these kinds of disruptions are projected to become more severe as we move towards 2100. Climate change also affects indigenous peoples and their way of life. Indigenous peoples differ from much of the nation in that they are very much tied to their place where they live and have lived for many generations. And moving away is just not part of their way of life. And so the impacts that they're feeling are changing their traditional way of life and threatening their health. And two examples are shown in the pictures: growing wild rice in the upper Midwest and impacts in Alaska. Ecosystems are being altered and in some cases will become overwhelmed. The figure shows how fishery landings in New England have been shifting already with time, moving northward. So the landings for those commercially important fisheries, the major landing sites have been moving further north, and that means that the fishermen who are living in the more southern ports either have to move or they have to move further afield to continue their livelihood. In addition to those kinds of shifts in the ecosystems, the capacity of these ecosystems is being damaged. Their ability to buffer us and to buffer themselves from climate change extreme events is being altered. Ocean waters are also dramatically changing. Not only the temperature that we see and feel and affects us on land is affecting the ocean, but the ocean also is affected by ocean acidification. So the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere actually is also then dissolving into the ocean and making it more acidic. You can see in the graph, the red line represents the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as has been increasing, and these are direct measurements. The blue line is the amount of CO2 that's being directly measured in the water off of Hawaii, and the green line shows how the acidity of the water, the same place off of Hawaii, is been decreasing. So the oceans are acidifying, and that process will continue as long as the atmosphere has as much CO2 in it as it does today. And these changes in the pH are dramatically starting to affect a range of organisms. In the bottom pictures show how in the future these kinds of growth conditions will affect the size of clams, but we've also seen effects and predict effects from lab experiments on organisms such as corals and small organisms that live in the ocean that are the part of the food chain that feed up to organisms that we use as food, such as salmon. But broadly speaking, wide-ranging effects are possible across all parts of the ocean ecosystems all around the world. And so this is a very significant impact of two things, both the temperature changing and becoming warmer and also more acidic. And I should mention that the warming is one of the main parts of what we see affecting our coastal zone with sea level rise. The coasts are a place where much of the country lives. Tremendous amount of our economy is also focused in the coastal zone. And this shows one example of our infrastructure, where so much of the infrastructure, especially for the oil industry and energy industry, is focused, in this case, in the Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico area. But the transportation hubs, the movement of people on the interstates and the other transportation around in the area and rivers, can be affected as sea level rise changes and is affected by storm surge, events like Katrina, and other kinds of climate-related events will affect these coastal zones, not just in the Gulf, but all around the country. The report, as an assessment, also tries to capture what kinds of activities have been taking place, or adaptations and mitigation. What decisions are being made to cope with these changes that are already taking place. And one of the key findings then is that there are a lot of plans that are being made currently, and the report captures many of those in various sections. But the activities and actions that are flowing from those plans are still quite limited. And certainly the current rate of implementation efforts are insufficient to the challenge that we face as we move forward with these different kinds of effects of climate change. These pictures show two different kinds of adaptations, green roofs on the right and solar panels on the left. So those are the 12 key findings of the report, and I'd like to shift now to talk a little bit about the program and how the U.S. government was organized to deal with climate change and to produce the report. So I work at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and it is a consortium of 13 federal agencies. You can see their logos on the right side of the screen. And it's led by the Executive Office of the President, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and it was chartered in the Global Research Act in 1990, so almost 25 years ago now. And the key component of the law that it's important to realize is shown in blue, that the US GCRP is supposed to help not just the nation, but the world understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. So it's a very, very large remit. And up till now, the program has done most of its work in the understanding and prediction component, been somewhat successful with assessment, although I must say this third assessment report has been extremely successful, and I'll talk about how we plan to build on that success. But the respond component is one that has not been a major focus of the program in its early first 2 decades. And so part of the law also requires us to produce a strategic plan every 10 years. So the most recent one came out in 2012. And now we have 4 pillars corresponding to those components that I just described from the law. Advanced science pillar is the basic research that we've always done and continue to represent the largest component of the USGCRP budget, which in the federal government is about $2.6 billion. But it also includes pillars such as informed decisions, which is to move the science, the basic research and science conducted across the federal agencies to help inform decision makers and become usable and useful science for decision support and adaptation and mitigation. The sustained assessment pillar is the one that promotes the report that we are talking about today and covers not just our national climate assessment, but also our office is the one in charge of helping and support the IPCC process through the US government and other kinds of international assessment and regional assessment activities as need be. The fourth pillar is communicating and educating what we learned throughout the US Global Change Research Program to the public and educating everyone in all aspects of what we're doing so that the information is widely available. And I'll talk more about how we do that. And you'll see that very clearly as I show you some about our new website, which was also released on the same day as the report. So as we look to create this third national climate assessment, and it was the third one since 1990, despite the law requiring the US government to produce them every 4 years. So the Obama administration is committed to meeting that metric, and the third one meets that, and the plans for the fourth and moving forward include trying to always produce them within that 4-year timeline as required by the law. It was quite a large, inclusive activity with many authors to the report itself. We had a federal advisory committee guiding the process with 60 members representing every state and all kinds of sectors, different groups from NGOs to private partnerships, state and local governments, the tribes. Considerable amount of public engagement with many listening sessions around the country. We had Federal Register notices asking for public input. We had considerable amount of reports that were prepared around the country specifically to help inform our writing and the producing of the report. And then we underwent an extensive review, well over a year's worth of multiple reviews, not just by the national academies and by all of the federal agencies that were involved, but also a 3-month-long public review, which received over 4,000 responses. And the response to all of those comments that came in about the drafts of the reports are available to the public to see, so the process is very open. One of the keys to the process in keeping it open was the fact that we reached out and asked what kinds of new topics should the report include this time compared to previous assessments. And that's something that we plan to continue and is an opportunity for everyone to consider and propose and implement new chapters in the fourth National Climate Assessment in 2018. This time is the first time that in one of these reports we've covered the oceans as a separate topic. There were groups that formed and said that we absolutely must consider other aspects of the country, such as the urban and rural communities. Land use, land cover was covered, but also a strong push for cross-sectoral issues that have come up over the years, that rather than, as the law requires, that we just discuss the energy sector, important issues had their own chapters, such as the nexus between the use of energy and the production of the energy and needs of the water sector and land use and land cover change as a group of issues that all end up overlapping and impacting each other. And so they now form their own chapter. And we have several of those that are exploring these new linkages as we think about the complexities of climate change and how they'll impact the United States. Part of the development of the process also looked at how we supply information and support the kinds of information that's in the report, and the Global Change Information System is one of those activities. It uses and leverages new approaches to the World Wide Web called the semantic web to increase the utility of the information in the web. It's more of a web. Instead of finding pages in a Google search, you can actually find the data underlying activities and link data in dynamic and exciting new ways. And so we have implemented a semantic web underlying the National Climate Assessment as a test bed. And the plan is that that information system will be broadened out across the federal government over the next few years. And I'll show you an example of that as we go through the website, where you can use the GCIS underlying the report to access various kinds of information underlying the report in ways that weren't possible before. Another innovation this time was the use of something we call traceable accounts. The report's really designed to be a communications tool to everyone, to all stakeholders in the country, yet there's a need to explain more fully to everyone why the authors of each chapter chose the topics that they did to talk about, and how they would discuss what kinds of new information there was, and provide a bit more technical information and discussion using more technical language than they were able to use within the report itself, which had to be more accessible. So the traceable accounts are a description of how the authors in each chapter met, how the process that they went through to come to agreement on the topics to cover in their chapters, what they thought their confidence level was in the statements they made in their chapter about the key messages and the changes that they thought would occur. And so it gives you a much richer flavor for each of the key messages in each one of the chapters to dive a bit deeper into what exactly was their thinking. So the website URL is shown here, and the landing page for the NCA report. And the website is designed and was rolled out, as I said, on the same day as the report itself. And in fact, the full report is only available on a website. The only part that's printed for the first time in a report of this magnitude by the government, only as the highlights section, which you can see on the left of the screen, is available as a printout, and it's only about a tenth the size of the entire report. The full report then is only available and accessible online. And you can delve into all kinds of aspects of the report using this website. And I'll walk you through a little bit of that so you can see how to access it. At the top, you can see in the green circle that there's search buttons. So you can use a search and find specific components scattered throughout the over 1,000 pages of the report. You can also download the report, not just the full report here, but components of the report that most interest you. The other green circle in the bottom right are social media links to Facebook, Twitter, and to copy the link that will take you directly to the page that you're on. And so you can, at any point when you find something that you find particularly interesting throughout the report, you can let other people know and allow them to access it very directly and quickly, so that they can find the piece that you think that they should see. So if we go in and click on the full report, you can see that there are several sections, and you can access those sections either across the top or through the icons at the bottom. So there's the section called Our Changing Climate. That's where the bulk of the climate science itself is located. Then there is a series of sectoral chapters, things like energy, the chapter I mentioned on energy, water, and land. The regions include the 8 regions of the country, as well as the coasts and the oceans. And then there's a series of chapters on the response strategies. And those are adaptation, a chapter on mitigation, and a chapter on decision support. You can access, using those navigation, red button, red and white circles on the side, gives you an idea then where you are in the report. If we open up one of those sections, such as the regions, you can see each of those 8 regions of the country and the oceans and coasts available to click and enter. So if we go into something like coastal zone development and ecosystems, the coast chapter, you can again go up to the right and download just this chapter. And you can also tweet the link to exactly where this is for the entire chapter, or you can continue and go further into the chapter. And across the top, you see not just the introduction to this chapter, but this chapter has 5 different key messages that the authors wanted to convey to the public and to Congress. And those key messages can be accessed either by clicking through them or walking through them one by one. But you can also see on the right that the graphics are available in high resolution for downloading and free use for educational purposes or however they're meant to be used. But you can also go further and access what we call the metadata, which is what I mentioned about the Global Change Information System. You can download the file here, the actual figure, but you can also at the bottom start to access the actual data sources, the person who created it, links of various sorts, with a tremendous amount of rich information that you can access directly through looking at this metadata. And in fact, there's a paper that just came out in Nature Climate Change that talks about how the GCIS system and its implementation here in this report are available so that people can track the provenance of the kinds of data, and not just the data, but for instance, from NASA's point of view, which satellite some data might have come from and which sensor on that satellite it came from, as well as how it was processed, where the data is stored. So it's a very rich source, much deeper than one would have with a printed report. So that's the actual report that we finished. And as we looked forward to moving to the next 4 years and another report, and every 4 years thereafter is called for in the law, it was clear that we didn't want to have to recreate this process again and again and start from scratch. And more than that, that there was a deep need and considerable amount of information to be gained if we could sustain the assessment process and actually view the report itself not as an end, but as something that just captured and harvested information about climate change and how we're changing our adaptation and how it's affecting us in a continuing process. And the report then just is a punctuation in a process rather than the end game as it tends to be when we try to produce a single report. So the goal of this process that we call the sustained assessment is shown here. So we want to foster deepening our understanding of climate change across the country. We want to use the process to foster and highlight new scientific issues that we can capture in the next assessment, so we don't have to always be capturing the same things. New topics can be featured if we foster the kinds of science that underlies what is happening. We want to be able to build capacity for these assessments, for people to use it effectively, to be able to conduct their own assessments and feed the information back up into the next assessment report. We want to be able to help support, as part of the process, the decisions that need to be made, and we'll provide a process that gives us a full review of all the issues of national importance. And the efficient is really critical in these days of reduced budget. We want to do this in a way that increases our efficiency and leverages the information across all of not just the federal agencies, but activities that are captured increasingly at the local levels, not just states, but regional associations, tribal consortia, and county governments, NGOs. Everybody is doing a tremendous amount of work, and we want to be able to help coordinate and leverage everything that's going on. So the way we see that working is demonstrated in this series of slides, where time is moving towards the right. And as we've done in this report, there are envisioned to be a series of what we call foundational or base underlying reports to the whole process. So we already in this report developed a series of scenarios, projections of future climate change based on climate models, but also we're now actively engaged in a process of developing new scenarios on land use, land cover change, and scenarios on population. And the federal agencies such as the Census Department and others then are collaborating in new ways with the U.S. Global Change Research Program agencies to develop these scenarios that can then be used for planning, not just across the agencies, but all throughout the nation. We've developed a series of pilot indicators of climate change across the nation through a process involving 15 different teams with different themes. These pilot indicators are going to be released in the next 2 months, and the plan is that these will move from being a pilot system of indicators to a regularly updated system of indicators, with the idea that in 100 years, 200 years, that we'll be looking back at these indicators and be able to use them to start to see how things have changed in the long term as we hopefully manage this process and the problem of climate change. Valuation is another topic that's of great interest. It's not just understanding how much the cost of climate change might be, the cost of inaction, but also how do we value things like ecosystems and way of life and social justice. So the process that we've had has incorporated this. We plan to continue with more foundational reports. Of course, the U.S. Global Change Research Program is focused on science. So how do we increase the best science and make sure it's usable and available to be used? So as we move beyond the current generation of models, the CMIP-5, we're already thinking about how to better incorporate that into our planning, but also moving beyond to the next CMIP process. Decision support tools. Hurricane Sandy motivated a tremendous amount of activity through a whole range of federal agencies in response to that disaster. And many of those support tools now are available on our website through collaborations from diverse agencies, including FEMA and EPA, NOAA, and NASA, as well as the local governments in the New York area, the area impacted by Sandy. And the idea is to continue to develop and provide on our website decision support tools based on good, solid climate science. As I mentioned, we've been involved with a range of assessment efforts, but the idea is as we move forward, we'll continue to foster development of a range of assessments. So for instance, the next Arctic assessment is being planned. There's an adaptation in the Arctic plan to produce a report in 2017 when the United States is head of the Arctic Council. And so that will be coordinated with our ongoing efforts for our 2018 National Climate Assessment. The process to develop this assessment and the future ones will also include what we call technical inputs. So there were, for instance, in each of the regions of the country, all 10 of them, they produced detailed, hundreds of pages long with many, many authors, detailed analyses that then were used and fed into the process so that the authors of the particular chapters in the report could draw upon those much more detailed analyses to write the much smaller number of pages that they were using for our report. So those analyses, various kinds of literature reviews, are places where everyone can foster those and feed them into our report as we move forward. And the US GCRP will be funding a whole range of those over the next few years to support the next report. We're also well into planning a whole series of what we call special topics reports. These will be federally funded deeper dives into particular topics that are of interest across the agencies. So for instance, climate change and human health is well underway in its planning right now. It's a consortium with Health and Human Services and EPA and other agencies. And USDA is producing a report on food security. Groups of agencies are coming together to talk about reports on drought. The Department of State is considering reports on things like on international connections for the United States and the impacts of climate change. So a whole series of topical reports will be stacked up and fostered over the next few years to feed into the next report. Critical component of the sustained assessment process, and one we've been working on very actively in the last 4 years developing this report, are connecting to existing networks and building new ones. So the existing networks, things like the Department of Interior has funded a whole series. So in addition to the various special topics, a critical component is to connect to the many networks that already exist across the country. In particular, ones like the Department of Interior has a series of climate science centers. NOAA maintains a group of networks called the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, the RISAs. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has recently created a series of climate hubs. These are all designed to reach out to their stakeholders to foster their mission of those agencies to work with stakeholders across the country to provide the right kinds of information about climate change and climate science and work with them to provide the right kinds of decision support tools. So we're actively connected to them and working to leverage and foster collaborations across those federal networks. And then we've created something called the NCA-Net, the National Climate Assessment Network, which has over 130 partners that include NGOs, state and local groups, many federal agencies, a whole range of different kinds of activities that have their own stakeholders. So the Union of Concerned Scientists, for instance, is holding a series of webinars this week and are reaching out, talking about the climate assessment and the information in it to their stakeholders in a series of webinars. And many of the other NCA-Net partners are also then working with us to broadcast the messages and the science within the National Climate Assessment, but again, thinking more broadly about the sustained assessment process, working with us to tell us what their needs are and to produce the kinds of information that everybody is going to need. And so all of these activities that I've described then would just be harvested or captured and described and assessed in these quadrennial reports. But it's the process itself, the activities, that are so critical. And as we then move forward in time, these activities would be repeated then after 2018. Another report would come out. We would again repeat them, and the process moves forward in a sustained basis. So the reports then just kind of fall out of the process itself rather than being the end of the process, and then we all heave a sigh of relief and wait a while and then panic and try to produce a new report. It's the process. So moving on to using climate information from the report and other components within USGCRP, the President's Climate Action Plan is really one of our main drivers. So the President's plan has been out since about a year now and really focused on using sound science to manage impacts. And there's 4 components that are shown. Second one, assess climate change impacts in the U.S. Certainly the National Climate Assessment is a major deliverable as part of this plan and the sustained process to continue producing them as part of that component of the President's plan. GCRP writ large in our strategic plan are all about trying to develop more actionable climate science and get it out to those people who need it. And as part of that, I mentioned the toolkit that arose out of activities of the federal agencies from Hurricane Sandy, with those toolkit pieces all available on our website, and new ones are being planned as the next phase of that activity to develop new ones to increase climate resilience across the federal agencies and across the nation by providing a consistent set of tools that everyone can work from. And I mentioned the Global Change Information System. That is a major deliverable of the Climate Data Initiative that was part of the Climate Action Plan. There's a move to make all kinds of climate science across all federal agencies more open and accessible, which is a separate but closely linked effort. And it's also related to the larger effort that the President started several years ago on called data.gov that makes all government data available for use by anybody across the country. And so those 4 pieces are all deeply embedded into what we try to achieve here at USGCRP. The President also issued an executive order that all of the agencies have been working towards over the last year. And as part of that, you can see here, it requires the federal agencies to update adaptation plans. So they're having to plan and adapt how they're going to adapt to climate change as part of their operating processes. So all of their activities are mainstreaming now as part of their activities, including their budgets and their grant making and their mission and regulatory activities, have to produce these plans and then implement them on how they're going to cope with climate change. And that is directly tied to the publication of the National Climate Assessment reports every 4 years. And so the federal agencies are wrapping up their current plans and will be releasing them for review soon. So it's a major activity within all federal agencies to produce these plans and to begin how they're going to actually adapt to climate change. The tabletop exercises, I mean, one day after the assessment was released, FEMA, the Management Agency for Disaster Relief, was actively involved in an exercise with its staff using the climate assessment and the scenarios that were part of it to consider how climate change will impact their operations. And a whole series of pilot projects are in the works for agencies to begin using the assessment and the various products such as the sea level rise scenarios and other products to begin pilots to actually begin adaptation actions. Another component is how we're going to incorporate into all the agencies evaluating their progress in adaptation and in their decision making. And so a lot of thinking is going into all different components of this executive order. Beyond the executive order and the federal family, there's the hope that the plan that the third assessment will provide a lot of success stories out into the nation so that they can see that there are people taking action, that there are things that one can do, and they can also get the kinds of information that they need to produce their own success stories. So as we move towards the fourth assessment in 4 years, that their success stories will become integral to the next assessment process. I've already mentioned several of these research topics and the special reports that are underway currently, but I want to make the point that there's a whole range of potential for additional ones that can come up from community involvement and from any number of sources that could prove to be extremely useful and exciting for the next assessment as we move forward in the sustained assessment. And the same goes for partnership development. We're continuously looking to broaden participation in NCANet, particularly in the business community, and working with them to see how we can best provide the kinds of information that they require. That's an area that certainly we have lagged very far behind, working with many of the other kinds of partners in local and state governments and NGOs. Another area that we're actively involved with in the NCA report can become a tool for is to teach people and to train people in science translation and workforce development so that we can have the right kinds of people to sustain this assessment process as we move forward over the next decade.
Thank you, Fred.